Samson's story in the Old Testament is another one of those stories that are familiar to a lot of kids. Well, at least the character of Samson anyway. The story, maybe there's much detail given to the story of Samson to kids. Maybe for some kids, maybe so for other kids, maybe not. But the character of Samson, we are very familiar to both adults and children, obviously. And the one thing that we know about Samson, one of the best known things about Samson, is his incredible strength, his superhuman strength, if you want to call it that. Of course, I think you can chalk it up to being divine strength. And his hair, his long hair and everything, where his hair was cut off by Delilah and everything like that. And so, as part of our series of childhood classics, we want to take a look at Samson, find out what's going on there, and ask this question coming into this, because Samson didn't have a glowing story in the Bible. Let's get that right. But let's ask this question: is there a redeeming quality in Samson's story that we can take note of? Maybe not. We'll talk about that when we go through the story. So I think we're in for some good observations and good discussion. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Yeah, so the story of Samson. Actually, when it comes to Samson's portion in the Bible, in the book of Judges, there are a couple of stories about Samson. I mean, I think they all eventually tie together. But we get a very good look at Samson the man. And when it comes to looking at this as a childhood classic, I don't know if we look at it so much as a story of Samson and what happened in his life. But again, I think if we're talking about what children know about Samson, it's him as somebody who possessed physical strength. And what I'm going to point out to you here in a little bit is that that's not strength within himself, physical strength within himself, but that's a divinely given strength, specifically come from the Holy Spirit, actually. And the fact that he had long hair and that his hair was eventually cut off and that he became weak like any other man. So those are the things that I think a lot of children are familiar with. If you were to ask them maybe to give a little bit of the details of the story of Samson, some might be able to tell you, some might not. Again, I'm not sure. And it depends on what church you grew up in and who taught you and everything like that, the specifics of the story of Samson. There are 4 chapters in the book of Judges that are dedicated to explaining Samson's story. And so I think that we're not going to go in detail through all of those chapters. Actually, where we want to settle is the last chapter of the story, which is going to be in Judges chapter 16, and go through that there. But we'll go as briefly as we can through the background story of Samson and things that happen. But like I said, his story shows up in the book of Judges, and probably by far is probably the most well-known judge in the book of Judges than anybody else. You're not going to have a lot of people who have trouble identifying Samson and his character, that is if you've been a Christian for a while, and saying, yes, I know about the character of Samson. I was just thinking about this the other day. It's interesting, we're talking about childhood classics. It's interesting that when I grew up, the cartoon that I grew up on, that has to do with biblical stories and everything like that, was Superbook. And Superbook was a cartoon that highlighted, stories from the Old Testament. And what's interesting is that there were 2 separate episodes given and dedicated to a couple of judges that really, even in the adult Christian world, people probably don't have any knowledge of at all. Othniel, right, is one of them, and then Ehud is another one. 2 separate episodes for each of those characters on a children's show, on a children's cartoon that's dedicated to those 2 characters. And I just find that interesting, because if you were to ask an adult, hey, who do you know who Othniel is in the Bible? Othniel. I'm kind of saying that fast. Othniel. Or Ehud. I'm pretty sure that there would be a large number of people who would say that, no, I have no idea who that person is. Samson, yes, you ask them who Samson is, and people will, again, if you've been a Christian for a while, or if you've grown up in a Christian home or grown up in the church, no doubt you've probably been told about Samson. And so, people will say, yes, we know about Samson. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. That was just kind of an interesting thought. I was just thinking about that this week as I was preparing for this, and I was thinking it's interesting that Ehud and Othniel are two people that had episodes dedicated to them in a children's cartoon back in the 80s, but we really don't know much about them. There was an episode, by the way, dedicated to Samson. I do remember watching that as a kid as well. But yeah, Judges is, if we're talking about Judges, no matter who you're talking about, whether you're talking about Othniel, whether you're talking about Ehud, whether you're talking about Gideon or Jephthah, Judges is an interesting book. And in some ways, it's kind of a depressing book. If you're familiar with Judges, or if you're not, here's the pattern of Judges that you have going on there. You have the Israelites who have gone into the land that was promised to them, and this is all after Joshua has died, and they take possession of the land. But instead of totally wiping out the foreign peoples that were there, as the Lord instructed them to do, because remember, the Lord instructed them to totally wipe them out, because if they didn't, then they would stick around, and then they would entice them to follow their gods and everything like that. So when it comes to the book of Judges, they take possession of the land, but they don't totally wipe out the people that are there. So you naturally see the consequences that God warned about happening to the Israelite people. And so you see this constant pattern that shows up within the book of Judges. So you have a rebellious people in the people of Israel. After Joshua's generation and everybody, they died, and they turned to other gods, and they rebel against God and everything. And so God, in judging these people, in bringing judgment on these people, raises up a foreign power to oppress them. And so in their oppression, the Israelite nation cries out to the Lord, and the Lord in mercy, so he enacts judgment, and then in mercy, in hearing them cry out to him, raises up a judge or a deliverer to deliver them out of that oppressive power. And so as long as that judge was alive, there was peace. And then once that judge died, then the cycle would start all over again. The judge dies, and then Israel, rebels against the Lord. They follow other gods, that whole thing. God brings judgment by a foreign power. They cry out to the Lord. The Lord raises up a judge and everything like that. And so that's the pattern that you have. And so, when the first few cycles of this whole thing, as it relates to the judges themselves, you get some pretty stellar judges that come to the rescue of Israel through the strength of the Lord and everything like that. But the thing that if you read through the book of Judges, the one thing that you notice is that there's sort of a degeneracy, at least moral or character degeneracy, the further along you go in the story of the book of Judges, as it relates not only to the nation of Israel, but to the judges themselves. And so you start to see more and more, character fluctuations that aren't good within these judges, that you don't see in the judges that happened before them. And so with this kind of gradual downward slide of these judges, you finally get to somebody like Samson. And so Samson is one. If you want to talk about degeneracy, he's kind of at the peak of everything that you see as far as the things that continually go are wrong with the judges that are presented in the book of Judges. Okay, in fact, through pretty much most of his story, and again, there's 4 chapters dedicated to his story. There isn't anything glowing about Samson. I keep wanting to say Samuel. I keep having to catch myself from saying Samuel, but it's not Samuel. It's Samson. Samuel doesn't. It's in 1 Samuel. But anyway, so there isn't a lot of things that are glowing about Samson. Now you do see some unique things about Samson. I'll tell you about those things in a little bit. But at the start, of Samson's story, we get a glimpse of what he's destined for. And so in chapter 13, what's laid out in chapter 13 is pretty much his Samson's origin story. Have you ever heard of an origin story in the comic book world? That kind of like that. I mean, it's not as glamorous. It's not as action-packed. It's not as colorful or anything like that in the comic book world. Maybe origin story isn't the best word to use here, but in chapter 13 of Judges, we're let in on the announcement of the future birth of Samson to his parents. Okay. And specifically with the angel of the Lord that appears to Samson's mother, it says, if we look here in chapter 13 of Judges, and in verse 3, it says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son." So I guess one thing to point out about Samson is that he's a miracle child. Samson's mother was barren, was not able to have any children. And of course, we see these sorts of things in the Old Testament. We see it with Abraham and Sarah and with other people in the Old Testament, where a woman who is barren and is not able to have children, by the miracle hand of God, is able bears a son. Okay, and the same thing that you see here. But as you continue on in verse 4, what we have there, it says, "Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." So the Philistines, when all of this is going on, is the foreign power that's oppressing Israel at this time. Because again, we've gone back to the whole thing of Israel rebelling against the Lord. Actually, you see that in the very first verse of chapter 13. "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. So that's the setting here. So when Samson's birth is announced, the Philistines are that oppressive power that's oppressing Israel. And so Samson is going to be that instrument, that vehicle used by the Lord to help deliver the people of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now, what's interesting here, and here's one of the unique points of this. One unique thing about Samson is that he's the only judge in the book of Judges that has this whole thing of an announcement of his birth before he's even born. And talking about all of those things. That's one thing. Another thing that's unique is that he's the only judge that has this regulation laid upon him of being a Nazarite for life, pretty much. From the womb on is pretty much what the angel of the Lord is saying, that he shall be a Nazarite. Now, if you want to know more about the Nazarite vow and the regulations of that, you can look at Numbers chapter 6. Really, the first 8 verses of Numbers chapter 6 is all you need to be familiar with as it relates to Samson, because I think in the rest of that chapter, in Numbers chapter 6, it talks about what to do when your period of being a Nazarite and taking the Nazarite vow is finished. But with Samson, that sort of thing doesn't apply, because he's to be a Nazarite for life. So in those first 8 verses, the regulations that are laid out for somebody who takes a Nazarite vow is that they are not to drink any wine or any fermented drink or anything from the grapevine or anything like that. That's, again, probably one of the reasons why Samson's mother herself was commanded not to drink any wine or any fermented drink. And I think the idea of that is don't do that in the course of your pregnancy, is probably what you're dealing with there. So that was part of the Nazarite regulations. They were not to shave their head. Again, for as long as that person was under the Nazarite vow, they were to let their hair grow. Now, of course, with Samson, if he's a Nazarite for life, then he's never going to cut his hair. So that's why the angel is saying that it says that no razor shall come upon his head. Okay. Samson is never going to get a haircut. Now, I know that, some of you who are parents and maybe you have kids who despise getting haircuts or going to the barbershop getting haircuts or whatever like that. Something like this might seem very attractive to them. So Samson's never going to get a haircut. At least he's not supposed to. Now, of course, we're going to see later on in the story that he does. And then he's as a Nazirite is not to have any sort of contact with a dead body. Now, in the passage in Numbers chapter 6, it really speaks specifically of a dead human body, but I think that it stands to reason that it means any sort of deceased carcass. And so when you take these things into consideration and line them up with Samson, you see that Samson breaks at least two of these regulations, okay? Arguably, some people have said that he broke the third as far as drinking wine, but it doesn't really say that explicitly. It just says that he went to a feast. Now, of course, at a feast there is alcohol, so maybe he did drink, but the text really doesn't say that he did. So let's leave that out. Let's assume that he kept that, okay? Or at the very least, we don't know. There's a big question mark by that. He did come in contact with a dead carcass, with a lion. We read that in chapter 14. And then as you see in chapter 16, he does have his hair shaved. Now, of course, he himself didn't do that. Delilah did it for him, and it was while he was asleep. But Samson is still responsible for that, and we'll explain that explain why that is when we get to that point. But so there you have in chapter 13, and of course there's a lot of detail that I'm leaving out there, and hopefully you'll take your own time to read the specifics of the story in all of these chapters, in chapter 13 and everything like that. But so that's what's laid out for Samson. Samson is set aside as to be a Nazirite, dedicated and separated to the Lord, as a judge who is going to deliver Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now, when you get into chapter 14 on, what we read of Samson is somebody who is, I mean, there's a lot of problems. Okay. Now, again, like I said, Samson serves as that pinnacle in the story of the judges of what a judge should not look like. And what we start out with, we kind of see, and we're kind of given a glimpse into what one of Samson's weaknesses is. It's women, and not just women, but it's foreign women, Philistine women. When you look and when you start to read into chapter 14, he sees a Philistine woman in Timnah, and wants to marry her. Doesn't know who she is. It's just probably a good-looking lady. And says, I want that woman as my wife. Now, the parents are like, isn't there somebody within the Israelite community that you want? Samson's like, no, I want that woman there, who's a Philistine, a part of a group of people, of foreign peoples, that the Lord instructed the Israelites before entering into the land, don't intermarry with these people. That's not because of any sort of racism or anything like that. But again, for religious purposes, God is saying when you do that, then they're going to lure you away to worship other gods, and they're going to be a snare to you. So you're not supposed to do that. Again, in fact, what he said is that you're to totally wipe out the people once you come into the land. But that's what Samson said. That's what Samson wants to do. Samson wants to marry this Philistine woman. And so everything is arranged and everything like that. Now, before we get to the whole marriage stuff and the whole marriage thing, we get this situation where it is as Samson is on his way to Timnah, a lion comes out and meets him on the road and attacks him. And so it says there that let me find the place here. In verse 6, it says, then this of chapter 14, verse 6 of Judges chapter 14, it says, then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. Okay, so here we get a first glimpse of Samson's incredible strength. And what we have to understand here is, and again, I mentioned before that this isn't something where this is just a physical strength in and of himself. Everything that you see regarding Samson's strength is totally divine. And you get that sense when you look at verse 6 where it says, then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. So after the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, then he was able to tear this lion limb from limb, something that from any regular human strength, somebody isn't able to do. So this is divine strength. The Spirit of the Lord is one who gave him the ability to do this, and that's how we should look at Samson's strength. Everything having to do with that is something that is totally a divine work that's done through Samson. Okay. Now, what's interesting, one thing to note here, and I heard somebody mention this in a message a long time ago, is that a lot of people, when they have a thought of what Samson might have looked like back then, a lot of people might picture him as this big muscular dude. In fact, when I mentioned the Superbook story and the story of Samson and the episode of Samson on Superbook, even his character is drawn as somebody who's very buff, is ripped, and is very muscular and everything like that. But this speaker was saying that who's to say that that's even what he looked like at all? You know, we assume that his human muscularage was something that contributed to it, but who's to say that we're not dealing with somebody in the person of Samson who's just a skinny beanpole of a person, who you would look at him and you would think that there would be no way that this person has any sort of strength at all to do much of anything. And so you have this skinny beanpole of a guy who is able to, with the strength of the Lord working through him, rip apart a lion, or to pull up the gates of a city, as we'll see later on, is what happens with Samson. You know, so sometimes we have these pictures in our heads of something that we're in our own minds, on an unconscious level, we attribute human strength to what Samson was able to do because we picture him as a buff, muscular guy. I mean, that guy must have been hitting the gym or something, lifting weights or something like that. But everything that we see with the strength that Samson has is totally because of the Spirit of the Lord. So we could very well be dealing with, and probably dealing with, somebody who just looks regular. You know, he's not ripped, he's not muscular, he's not anything like that. He's just look like a regular guy. And again, who knows? He might be a skinny beanpole of a person. But when the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him, he kills this lion, and there you go. Which catalogs all the more the amazingness from a human perspective of what you would be able to see Samson do in all of these exploits of him displaying this mighty strength of his. Okay, so he kills this lion. Now, as the story goes on, he's going back to Timnah, and he turns aside to where he had killed the lion before. And there's the carcass there, and here's where he comes in contact with the carcass, and he sees bees swarming around the body with honey, and so he scoops up the honey and starts to eat it on the way. Now, minusing anything having to do with ceremonial uncleanness because of the contact with the dead body, you got to think just overall from a hygienic standpoint. Samson, what are you thinking, buddy? I mean, it's gross all around. He just scoops this honey from the carcass of a lion and starts to eat it. It's like, no, Samson, don't do that. And then he gives some to his parents and doesn't tell his parents where he got it from. But anyway, when he arrives at Timnah, he's assigned with 30 companions. And so with these companions, he gives them this riddle that's sort of connected with everything having to do with this lion. And he says that if you solve my riddle, then I have to give you 30 sets of clothing. But if you do solve it, then I have to give you 30 sets of clothes. But if you can't, then you have to give sets of clothing to me. And so he sets a time period. I believe it's 3 days. I believe that they were given to do this. No, I'm sorry, 7 days. Let me see here. And verse 12, and Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast," so it's 7 days, "and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." Okay, so that's the whole thing there. Now, these people aren't able to solve it on their own, so they go to the woman and they threaten Samson's wife to be, and threaten her, say, "Tell us what this is, or you're gonna be sorry," pretty much. So Samson's fiance goes and pulls this whole stunt and says, why do you say you love me and yet you haven't told me the secret of the riddle, blah, 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 boo hoo hoo, that sort of thing. And so Samson, after she keeps bugging him about it, keep this in mind because we're going to see this theme come up again, finally gives in, tells the woman the answer to the riddle. And so the woman then goes and tells the companions. And so the companions at the end of the period is able to tell Samson what the answer to the riddle is. And so what you see the reaction of Samson in verse 19, he figures out, he says, you went and asked my wife and got my wife to tell you. That's how you figured out the answer. So in verse 19 of chapter 14, it says, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town and took their spoil and gave the garments to those who had told the riddle. In hot anger, he went back to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So you see somebody who has this really hot temper. You look at this and you think there's no justification for Samson to do what he did. Now notice, though, that even in light of that, in verse 19 it says, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and everything like that. Okay, so what's going on here? Because you have Samson acting in seemingly a very wicked way, but yet it's prompted by the Spirit of the Lord. Granted, we might be able to say that Samson's attitude was sinful, but what we also have to understand is that God sometimes uses somebody in their sinful attitude and in their sinful behavior to carry out his purposes against another people. I mean, you see this even with Israel as a nation. When Israel was exiled, first by Assyria in the north and then from Babylon in the south, God didn't use righteous nations to carry that out. He used wicked pagan nations to do those things. So, I mean, if he's able to do that, then I think that God is able to use people even when they're not at their best, to say the least. I mean, if we're talking about Samson, to carry out his purposes against the Philistines. And how do we know it's God's purpose against the Philistines? Because you read earlier in chapter 14, when Samson's parents are questioning Samson about his choice of wives. It says there in verse 4, it says, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At the time the Philistines ruled over Israel. So all of this was going to be used by God to bring destruction against the Philistines. And so even Samson, in his attitude and what you have there, God uses that to carry out what he already determined to happen against the Philistines. And so that's what you have there. Now, as you get into chapter 15, Samson had gone away. He's coming back and he wants to take his wife, but he learns from his father-in-law to be, or who was going to be his father-in-law, that, I thought that you hated her, so I gave her to somebody else. And so Samson is angry about that, and he says, now I have an excuse to go up against the Philistines. And so what he does is he takes several foxes and he ties their tails together and puts a torch in between them and sends them off into the Philistines' standing grain and burns down their fields and everything. And so everybody within the Philistine community is asking who did this, and they say it was Samson. And the reason why he did it is because of vengeance, because his wife was given to another man. And so the Philistines, as a result, in vengeance, go and burn the woman and the father. And so when Samson hears about this, he says, "I'm going to take revenge on this, and then we're going to be done with this." Okay, so then he goes and he just kind of has this massive destruction against the Philistine people because of all of these things that had happened. And so after all of this happened, he goes and he hides himself. He hides himself in a cave near Etam. Is the place, the cleft of the rock of Etam is the place where he goes and where he hides. Okay, and so with everything that Samson had done then, the Philistines are looking to wreak havoc and exact vengeance against Samson. Okay, now so the Philistines approach a town in Judah. And then the Judah says, "Hey, what's going on here?" And the Philistines says, "We're after Samson." So 3,000 men of Judah go and they get Samson, and so they tie up Samson to deliver him over to the Philistines, so that the Philistines don't wipe everybody out in Judah in the process of trying to get Samson. And so here's another one of those places where the Spirit of the Lord comes into this, and this is in chapter 15, verse 14. Where it says, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. So he gets free. And then in verse 15 it says, and he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. Okay, so again, all of this is by the Spirit of the Lord. Okay, that he's able to do these things, and so he has this massive victory against the Philistines, even here, by striking down 1,000 men. Okay, now that leads us all into chapter 16, which we're going to look at here. But take note of this here. We've already seen some differences and some pretty unique things about Samson. We've seen the description of his birth, which is described, or the announcement of his birth, which you don't see with any other judges in the book. And here's the other thing, and this is one thing that really sets Samson apart from all the other judges that you read about, is that Samson isn't one who leads an army. Did you notice that? He's not a judge who leads an army. All the other judges that have sufficient description of them, we're not talking about Tola, we're not talking about Jer, who have like one or two verses dedicated to them. We're talking about actual major characters within the book of Judges, are people who led an army, okay, of some sort. So we're talking about Ehud. I mean, after he killed Eglon, the Moabite king or Midianite king, one of those two. After he did that, he led an army of people to go up against the oppressive army, the army of the oppressive people there. You see the same thing with Barak. Now, of course, this was under the judgeship of Deborah, but Deborah, by command of the Lord, reaches out to Barak, and Barak is the one who's supposed to lead an army against the people, against Israel's enemies, right? So you remember that. Gideon, the same thing. Well, he was kind of afraid and waffled here and there just as far as his confidence. He was one who had charge of an army. Now, of course, he didn't necessarily have to lead the army into fighting, because if you read the story, what you see is that God sends a panic upon the people and they start killing themselves. But nevertheless, he is the head of an army. Same thing with Jephthah. All right. So you see these people, these judges that eventually become commanders of an army. Samson is no such commander. In fact, everything that you see with Samson is between Samson and the Philistines, not the Philistines and the Israelite army. You notice that? And so much to the point that, listen, you have people within the Israelite community, the people of Judah, who don't have Samson's back. If you're a commander of the army, you command the army, and the army has your back. The army follows you, okay? We don't see that. We don't see that sort of thing happening here with Samson, okay? With Samson, again, because when you go back into chapter 15 in the story, in verse 11, it says, then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so have I done to them. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. So here's 3,000 men of Judah who are willing to hand Samson over to the Philistines. So with Samson, what we're dealing with somebody, even though he is used of God as an instrument against the Philistines, As a character himself, Samson is somebody who operates more on personal vendetta than with somebody who is leading an army to deliver the nation of Israel from the oppressive hand of whatever foreign power is ruling over them. Okay, and that's a big difference there of what you're seeing there. So you're dealing with somebody who operates on personal vendetta. And you're dealing with somebody who is breaking his Nazirite vows, and you're dealing with somebody who has a weakness as it relates to women, and a weakness as it relates to having a hot temper, even though God will use that to carry out what he's already planned to do against the Philistines. Okay? So as somebody who doesn't have a glowing story, we're seeing all of it unfold, but we're not done. And here's where we really get to the crux of the story here. The finale of all of the judges in Samson's story, we're coming to a finale here, just as it relates to everything that happens to him. So when you get to chapter 16, it says Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute and went into her. So that's not good, obviously. But again, you see kind of that weakness that's going on there. And it says the Gazites were told Samson has come here, and they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till the light of the morning, then we will kill him." But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. So, mighty act of strength. And again, even though it's not mentioned there, since we've seen it in other places, I think it's safe to assume that the strength that you see there is the strength that is specifically given to Samson from the Holy Spirit. And so that's the strength that you have there. So with what follows, I think with that plus everything else that had happened previously, the Philistines are coming to an understanding that, there's no way that we're going to defeat this guy just by ourselves. He's very strong, and we need to subdue him somehow. So we need to find out the secret of his strength. Now, and so this is where we get into the whole familiar thing of Samson and Delilah. What's very interesting, by the way, just as a side note, one of the things that I noticed in going over this story again is that the strength of Samson isn't anything that was foretold to Samson's parents when they were laying out the regulations for him of being a Nazirite. There wasn't anything divine that was saying that he's going to be somebody who's going to be super, super strong by the power of the Holy Spirit or anything like that, just as long as he keeps his hair growing. Nothing like that is said. We're just automatically presented with that starting from the time when Samson kills the lion, right? But I think the Philistines understand that there's something divine about all of this, and they need to find out how to get Samson weak. Okay, I mean, just watching him pull up the bars and the gates of the city and carry them to Hebron, which I read is 38 miles from where he was. And then again, like we said, he killed 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of a donkey. And he's killed even before then as well. So they're dealing with somebody who, we're going to have to find out how to make this man weak. So that's where you get into the rest of the story here in chapter 16. So in verse 4 and following, it says, after this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And again, Delilah is not an Israelite. This is a Philistine that we're dealing with here. And it says, and the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, it says the lords of the Philistines, and you probably have one ruler or lord from from the Philistine areas. You have Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza, those 5 places. And so if that's the case, and 1,100 pieces of silver each, 5,500 of those, and that, just by those days' standards is a thoroughly good sum of money, to say the least. So Delilah is going to get rich pretty quickly here. And obviously we come to understand that Delilah is somebody who really doesn't love Samson. Samson may love her, but she doesn't love him. And at the drop of a hat, and if the price is right, he willingly wants to find out how Samson becomes weak for a hefty sum of money. So it says in verse 6, so Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies and how you might be bound that one could subdue you. Okay. Now, the question itself seems a little bit weird, but I mean, putting yourself in Samson's sandals, you might think, okay, well, maybe she's just curious. Okay. And so, he is going to say something. Now, of course, he lies about it. Okay. And so it's interesting. He lies about it. And, I don't think we need to go into detail, into descriptive detail. Again, on your own, you can look at these. You can read this on your own. But there's 3 different occasions where Samson tells a story, a made-up story about the secret behind his strength, and saying, if you do this, if you tie me up with this, then I will become weak like any other man. Now, the fact that he initially has to lie about it tells you something about what's going on with Samson the man here. Now think about it. His response is to lie. Now I think that from the story, when you read later, you get the impression that this is something that Samson indeed is not supposed to tell anybody. And Samson knows this. And so notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, that's not something that I'm allowed to tell you. I can't tell you that. It's a secret, and I'm not, by the command of God, whatever like that, I can't tell you. Instead, he resorts to lying. Well, now, why does he lie? Why does he lie instead of saying that's something that I can't tell you? I think that goes into his strong pull towards women. If he said, I can't tell you, then Delilah's like, he might have been afraid that Delilah might say, okay, that's it, then I'm out of here then. If you're not going to tell me the secrets of your strength, then I'm out of here. Goodbye. Now, Samson is enamored with this woman, and so he doesn't want to lose her, so he just lies. And I think at the initial point here, I don't think Samson had in mind or thought that Delilah was going to put this whole thing to the test. Obviously doesn't know that there's this plot against him from Delilah, right? And so, let's look at this first example here. So she asks him and everything, and Samson answers in verse 7. It says, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Okay. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. Now, whether he did this willingly, if he was awake, or if she did this while he was asleep or whatever, either way, it's not good. And then in verse 9 it says, now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, and she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings, and as a thread of flax snaps, and when it touches the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. So here's the thing. So now we have, so Samson lied about it. And so now you have this whole thing where Delilah puts this whole thing to the test by binding him, and then says that the Philistines are upon you. Now, they were in an inner chamber. Now, whether they escaped or whether Samson really did see them and went after them and chased them away, whatever like that, who knows? But either way, you would hope that after this first incident that Samson would learn. But again, I think what you're dealing with is his lust for Delilah is so strong that he refuses to see what he should actually see in this whole thing. And that is that Delilah does not have his best interest at heart. So in 2 other times, Delilah asks, why did you deceive me? You lied to me. Tell me how you become weak. Tell me the secret of your strength. And so both of those times, Samson lies. And at both of those other times, Delilah puts Samson to the test and puts it all to the test. And each time she says, the Philistines are upon you. Now you think that after a while, Samson would think, okay, this is not good at all. Okay. Because she keeps wanting to test this whole thing out. And, she says that the Philistines are upon you. I think the Philistines are upon me, and I snap free or whatever, and I get free, and my strength is still with me. Something's not right here. You might think that Delilah has it out for me. You would think that is the natural thought that would come to any rational person's mind. But that's not what happened with Samson. And so he keeps playing this game. Now, if you notice here, after the third time, let's see here. Let's skip down to verse 16. She's gone through the whole thing. You've lied to me. Why do you keep lying to me? How can you say you love me? Blah, blah, blah. In verse 16, it says, and when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death. So in other words, she just kept pestering and pestering and pestering. And then finally Samson gave in. And remember what I told you to take note of before in chapter 14 regarding the riddle? We see the same thing happening with Samson's wife-to-be back at that time. In order to get the answers, the riddle out of him, she keeps bugging him and bugging him and bugging him and bugging him until he finally gives in, right? The same thing here, except this time, the situation of what we're dealing with here is much more serious and much more drastic. Okay. And so he finally gives in. So in verse 17, it says, and he told her all his heart, and he said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. Now, of course, if we're familiar with the story, we know that this is true. Samson has finally told the truth about the real deal, about the secret of his strength. Now, what we have to understand is that this isn't a superstition that we're dealing with regarding the hair itself. This isn't some sort of superstitious setup where, like, okay, shave the head and I become weak. The hair on his head and the length of it is a symbol of his separation unto God. It's the sign, that's the signal of who Samson is unto the Lord that's important, okay? And when you take away that symbol, then that symbol of being separated unto the Lord is taken away. And what you have is separation from God, or actually God separating himself from Samson. You see that, you're going to see that here in a little bit. But again, the same thing happens where Delilah puts this whole thing to the test. While Samson is sleeping, she brings somebody in to cut his hair off. And so Samson is shaved, right? And so we go through the same pattern as we see before. Look down at verse 20, and it says, and she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But listen to this. It says, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. Okay? He did not know that the Lord had left him. The Lord had left him. Wow, that's a scary thing. Okay, all because Samson allowed his head to be shaved. Now, you might look at this and you say, well, what's the big deal? Because it's not like Samson himself shaved his head. He didn't do it himself. Delilah did it. And he did it she did it while he was asleep. Can't you cut him a little bit of slack? But again, I think the idea is that this was something that he was not to tell anybody about, lest somebody do something like this. And so Samson in this situation was more concerned about his about this relationship with Delilah and keeping her happy, and also not being bugged by her at the same time, than he was in keeping the Lord's commandment as it related to the symbol of his head, of him being separated unto God as a Nazirite in a Nazirite vow. What God laid out for Samson suddenly was less important. Well, not suddenly. It had been, I think, less important for a long time. It's just that everything has come to a head here at this point of the story. Okay? So, everything with Delilah, pleasing her, and also at the same time getting her off of his back became more important than God and what God wanted for Samson's life. And so when all of that happened, the consequences came as they did. And it says that Samson did not know that the Lord had left him. That's why the Lord left him. Okay. So it says in verse 21, and the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. I can't even imagine what that must have been like. Not a fun experience by any means, I'm sure. Gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. So he's grinding grain and stuff like an animal doing this. His eyes are gouged out, and he's doing all this. But verse 22 says, but the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now, again, I think it's important that we don't look at this from a superstitious perspective, so that now that his hair is growing back, now he's going to become strong again. I think the reason why verse 22 there is mentioned as it is, the hair that's growing back is supposed to signify that even though Samson had messed up big time, and even though the Lord had left him because of his negligence in being open about the secret of his strength, the Lord in his grace and in his mercy was coming back to Samson, because God was not through with Samson in bringing about what he already had planned in bringing destruction on the people of the Philistines. Okay, I think that that's what you're dealing with there. So the whole mention of his hair growing back, I think, is a way of informing the reader that the Lord is coming back to him, and the Lord is still going to use him, even though Samson has been a huge disappointment up to this point. Okay, and so that's what you're dealing with. And so picture the scene here, even as you read the rest of the story, and as you read the rest of the verses there, you get a picture of a Samson that is unlike anything else, because Samson, all throughout this time when it comes to the Philistines, seems to have always had the upper hand. He's killed several people. And now Samson is paraded before the people of the Philistines like a spectacle. Okay. And so you have there in verse 23 and following, it says, now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. Now, I think that all of this whole thing of attributing everything to Dagon is going to work into God's final vengeance against these people. Because, of course, Dagon is not a god. Dagon is not a thing. Dagon didn't have anything to do with what's going on. And so God himself, over and against Dagon, is going to have the last word, okay, through Samson, okay. Verse 24, it says, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And that's true. He did kill many of those people. I mean, if you read through the stories and from verses 14 up to this point, you see that is true. Verse 25, and when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars. Now, what exactly the entertainment was, we don't know. We know it's not a stand-up comedy routine. We know that much for sure. Whatever the case is, the entertainment in him entertaining them, this wasn't something that's glamorous for Samson. All of this is a humiliating display. He is humiliated in front of all of these people, okay, is the idea that you get. Verse 26, and Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged of the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Now, here's a criticism that Samson sometimes gets, because you look at this, and it says, okay, all he's really worried about is his eyes and wanting to get vengeance for his eyes. And that might be true. I mean, there's a certain sense where you think that there's maybe some sort of self-serving attitude in his prayer as it relates to what he wants done to the Philistines and everything like that. But one thing that I think that we should be mindful of, and I think that should be brought to our attention, is that whole thing where he says, "Oh Lord, please remember me," okay? please remember me, okay? And I think that that's a personal appeal to him, understanding that he is a servant of the Lord. Yes, Samson has messed up royally, but I think Samson understands that he is a servant of the Lord. He is still a part of the community of Israel, and that he is in the midst of a bad situation among these, as people at that time would say, these uncircumcised people being made sport of. And Samson understands, and not wrongly so, he understands that these are the enemies of the Lord. And so I think this is his way of appealing to him and saying, see how these people are treating a member of your community, a servant of yours. And so he's saying, please remember me. Remember me in this sense. Remember when last time when we were looking at Noah, how it says that after the floods and everything, it says that God remembered Noah and his family and the animals on the ark. And how we talked about that, kind of chalked that up to meaning that God had a protective eye on those people. I think that that's what Samson is appealing to when he's praying this to God, okay, and so he's asking for vengeance for his two eyes. Now, here's another thing where we need to approach this with caution, and we might be ones who say, if we're criticizing Samson about his prayer of wanting to bring vengeance on the Philistines, let's be cautious about that, because we have to remember that somebody like David actually did the same thing in quite a few places, I believe, when you read his Psalms. If you want an example of that, and we don't have to go through it right now, again, read this on your own, but go to places like Psalm 109. That's a very good place where David is complaining about what his enemies are doing to him. And his request to God is essentially chalks up to vengeance against these people because of what they're doing to him. Right? So before we're quick to jump on Samson here, let's remember that somebody like David does the same thing in places like the Psalms. And again, like I said, if you want a specific example, I would point you to Psalm 109. Okay, but again, this whole thing of remember me, I think you're dealing with something where Samson is really coming to himself. And he's really realizing that he's messed up, and he's just saying, remember me, Lord, remember me. It's almost as if, he's saying like it's a prayer of repentance in some sense. Maybe not. That's open to interpretation, but I think that there's a possibility that you can look at this in that manner, in that way. And so he says, I want vengeance because of my two eyes. Now you look at verse 29, it says, and Samson grasped the two middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. That's another request. That's kind of unusual. I'll tell you about that in a second here. Let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed his head. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed during his life. So that's a pretty big toll. Just imagine what the total number of that would be. I don't know. But verse 31 says, then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, in the tomb of Manoah, his father, and he had judged Israel 20 years. Okay, so there you have the story of Samson. Now, here's the thing. What we just saw there is we saw somebody who was willing to die, right? Was willing to die in the whole thing of while he was taking care of the Philistines. And it's just very interesting because the only other time, I believe this is the only other time that you read of Samson saying anything to the Lord is back in chapter 15. And after he had killed everybody with the 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, after that whole thing was taken care of, in verse 18 of chapter 15, it says, and he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And then you read in verse 19 that the Lord listened to his request, and God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. and everything like that. So you see a little bit of a different attitude. The tone is different. And he's not saying, I want my life preserved. He's already in the hands of the quote unquote uncircumcised peoples, these Philistines. But I think he understands where God is now. And he says, I'm still on board with being being an instrument of bringing judgment on these people. Yes, he's messed up, but that's not even an issue now anymore. And so he says, in looking at this, he says he sees how these people are going to die. And so here you have Samson, who is willing to die in order to carry this whole thing out against the Philistines, which again is right up with what God has in mind to do with the Philistines. So at this point, I would say that Samson and God are on the same page. And Samson says, let me die with the Philistines. He's willing to die to get this accomplished. Whereas you do the comparison before, he says, I've done this wonderful thing. Now am I going to die here of thirst? It's kind of a complaining, sort of whiny sort of thing. You see something that's very different here. And so I think with that little bit of a difference, you kind of see a change in somebody like Samson. So this is the one, I think, maybe redeeming area that we see in Samson's life. Like I said, though, Samson is criticized a lot when it comes to this, but maybe there's a possibility that in interpreting this, that we can see this as a redeeming quality in the story of Samson at the very end of his life. And one thing that we have to remember is that in the New Testament, in the so-called Faith Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11, Samson is mentioned as somebody who exercised faith. Okay, he's mentioned alongside a couple other people from the book of Judges, Barak and Gideon. But there, and it's kind of in a list of honorable mentions, if you would say that there's such a thing. The honorable mentions in the Faith Hall of Fame, Samson is mentioned in one of them. Could it be because of his change of perspective that we see here in the last part of his life, in the last part of his story that we see here in Judges chapter 16? Could it be? Maybe that's a possibility. So what we see here is God working through somebody at the very end, even though Samson's story and what's revealed of his story in the book of Judges is not a glamorous, glowing story by any means. Now imagine what something like that says to people like us, is that even when we're at our worst, God in his mercy can still come and use us. And we can be people, if we recognize where we've gone wrong and where we're going off the rails, we come to the Lord in repentance and saying, Lord, forgive me. This is not where I need to be. And the Lord hears that request and continues to use you very mightily. It's not a matter of, okay, you've done too many things here, and here. My use of you is totally done. So the rest of your time on earth, you're going to be a useless nobody. No, that's not necessarily the case. If there's anything that we can learn from the story of Samson, we can learn that even with somebody at the very end of the road, who was messed up royally in so many ways, and that one change of perspective at that last moment, I think Samson was one who's saying, I want to be used of God in this area here. And God grants that request, gives Samson that strength. Again, all of this is by divine strength. And Samson is one who brings the house down, literally. Samson is one who literally brings the house down. And so that's how the story ends with Samson. So obviously a lot of stuff involved in this whole thing, just as far as the nuances of the whole story. Again, these are things that we don't go into detail about when we're teaching this story or teaching about the character of Samson to our kids. Or to little children. Maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't, I don't know. But at some point they need to learn the specifics and some of these detailed things that we can learn about, and some things that we can pick up from the story of Samson. And I think that what we can pick up from here are things that are pretty amazing. And so and really at the end of the day, listen to this, friends. Really at the end of the day, what this is what we see of God in this story. You remember I mentioned this kind of at this point when I was talking about Jonah and the ending of Jonah's story and everything like that. Well, Jonah is a central character in the story. Really, at the end of the day, with that story, what we learn is who God is and what God is like. And the same thing is going on here. Samson is a central part of the story, but the main character of the story here is God. And that's what we have to understand. And so we learn about who God is and his dealings with Samson, somebody who, again, is somebody who messed up royally over and over again. And yet God is able to gain glory for himself. Imagine what this says, to other people who understand that the Philistines worship a god like Dagon, and these are people who are giving Dagon the credit for delivering Samson into their hands. And now Samson, through the strength of God, brings the house down. And what's to be made of the Philistines' gods there? Especially when we come to an understanding that through that one whole thing, more Philistines died at that one incident than all the other Philistines that Samson had killed in his lifetime. That's truly something else. But even in the midst of his not so good moments, again, we've seen this just as we progress through his story. God used Samson in order to accomplish his purposes. And granted, they were during times when Samson was being a jerk and was not doing what he was supposed to, but I think that there's that one potential redeeming quality. Again, it just depends on how you look at the story. I think the way that you can look at it is that there's that potential of looking at it through that interpretive lens and saying that there is that redeeming quality at the end of Samson's story. And so, that's what we have. I mean, just as far as the story of Samson. So, story of Samson and Delilah, all those things. Another childhood classic that we've gone through here on Loving the Scriptures. So we'll leave it there. Again, like I said, go ahead, because we kind of did a brief, somewhat of a brief overview. We didn't do a verse by verse, through everything of all those 4 chapters, obviously. But read it for yourself. The story of Samson starts in chapter 13. So read through from chapter 13 all the way through chapter 16 and read the story fully for yourself. And really, if you want to even go back even more, just look at the whole thing in the context of the book of Judges. So maybe go back and read the book of Judges and starting from chapter 1 and reading through what you see here with Samson. Now, I said that Samson is the pinnacle of this whole thing as it relates to the Judges. And I say that because after that point in chapter 18 on, you kind of have an appendix to the book of Judges. That catalogs things that go on from an earlier time in Israel's history, and it doesn't really catalog any happenings with a specific judge. So that's why I say that, even though his story isn't the end of the book of Judges. But if you want to see the Samson story in the context of the book of Judges, then start from the beginning in chapter 1 and see if you can see what I see when you read through the Judges, is that gradual degeneracy, even in the character of the judges themselves, and how it reaches a heightened pitch in the person of Samson. And even at that point, God is able to accomplish his purposes through that person. So that's my encouragement to you as it relates to what we've talked about today. So again, like I said, we'll leave it there. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts. Also, you can follow Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. All right. Had a great time examining Scripture. As always, really enjoy this time, as always, like I always do. My name is Steve Gill, and I hope to see you right back here next time. Bye now.